So I originally made this is the first PowerPoint presentation I made after probably about 20 years ago or something. For some yoga people in Australia. So I didn't mention Krishna at once. So we'll just leave it under that. Maybe you can do something with distant people. Everybody is wondering about who we are and what the stories. We know that since ancient times people have been looking at the sky thousands and thousands of years ago. Even the cavemen were looking up at the sky and looking at things, and they built things like Stonehenge and the pyramids, etc. to align with the stars. And they were wondering why the planets were made with the stars, etc. And everybody developed calendar systems and astronomy. All societies in the world did this. They were looking up at the sky all the time. So the modern world also, people are looking at the sky. Normally we don't do it. Normal people don't do that, but the scientists are always looking up at the sky. So some years ago, we decided to send up a special thing called the Hubble telescope. And it went beyond the atmosphere. And that way they got clear pictures of what was up there. And then they were shocked when the pictures came back because what they thought were stars were not stars at all, but galaxies. And they had all these little points up there, they said, oh, stars. And then they went out and they talked with a Hubble telescope, and then they found out that what's not moving? So then you get all these pictures back, and the upper stars are actually galaxies. And galaxies are made up of like millions of stars. So then they just understood that the universe is much, much bigger, with much more galaxies and much more stars and planets than they ever thought of. Okay? So in this way, their consciousness got enlarged quite a lot because they understood that there was so many things they didn't know. And of course, since that time, we've gone on with other discoveries with the telescope, and they tried to calculate the size of the universe, diameter of the universe, or whatever, and discover black holes and things like this, and all sorts of mysterious things. So anyway, they discovered that there are many, many things we don't know about. In any case, they were very curious about what is this world. And that's what science does. We're trying to figure out the nature of this world, at least the pure science. And maybe mathematics, but physics also, we're trying to do that. So, at the present time, we have this whole concept, material concept of the universe according to science, and this is the size of it. It's a huge amount that we can't even imagine. Then the galaxies themselves are beyond our imagination, but between these galaxies, there's tons of space in between that, and everything is like it's minus whatever zero, minus 100 degrees zero or something out there, so it's inconceivable amount of space and all this throughout the universe. That's a very mysterious place. So, nevertheless, in India, they carried out the inquiry in a little bit different way. What science has discovered in the modern world that were actually very insignificant. The 100 planet around the sun, and the sun is within this galaxy among millions and millions of other suns. And this galaxy is one among millions and millions of galaxies. So, very insignificant in comparison to everything else. Nevertheless, we're here and we have awareness and we're thinking about things, and so therefore we try to understand our place within this whole universe and whatever. But in ancient times also, they were also thinking about that. It's not modern things to think about the universe and everything like that. The conception is a little different. But nevertheless, we see the Bhagavatam and in one of the Buddhist museums and whatever, they were thinking about what is this universe, what is the shape of the universe, etc. And they give it a kind of a shape like this with Mount Meru in the middle, and oceans and things around it. Looks a little fanciful now. They diagram this in the Earth and things like that as well. In any case, they're examining this universe, and they discover that there are some principles behind it. Just as in modern science, we have laws of physics, laws of gravity, laws of speed of light, and whatever we got. Then there's a little bit of some harmony between all of the different laws, and they try to put everything together. So, in ancient times also, they thought of the universe as something very harmonious. And it's based on some sort of mathematical principle. So that's why we see everything done in very symmetrical ways with circles and squares and triangles and whatever, mathematically laid out. So they diagram the universe in this way. This is the inquiry as far as material world is concerned. They discovered certain principles of unity there. And find it among the Vedic scriptures and the Buddhist scriptures and the Jain scriptures that generally have a very similar idea about the universe and its symmetry. They all have a Mount Meru in the middle, etc., which is very mysterious to us. Anyway, and even that's reflected in architecture. So temple architecture actually is a representation of the universe also. And that's made very clear in a temple like this is Angkor in Cambodia. So actually it is explicit, this Mount Meru in the middle and the whole universe spreading out around it. Actually the biggest temple in the world, Vishnu temple in the world at the moment. Well, we see also that nature itself reflects a symmetry. So mysterious in one sense are the biggest structures, the galaxies, and then down to the smallest planets. They all have some sort of, they work by certain laws, common laws. So the symmetry. And as human beings, we're a little bit puzzled by this, and maybe shocked or amazed by this. And we also try to find out symmetry in a human being. So, that Leonard, others will try to figure out the symmetry in the human body, etc. And similarly, of course, in India also, we find in the Vastu Shastras and scholarly Shastras, they analyze the human body in terms of triangles and squares and whatever like this, circles, etc., to figure out the symmetry of the body. So that's, of course, looking outside. The ancients, as well as the modern people, are looking outside to find some sort of truth, and we find some sort of harmony there, and with whatever observation we have. But then there's another process, and that is not to look outside, but to look inside. And this is what yoga is. Instead of looking outside, you look inside, which means you're not looking with this material eye at things, you're using your higher consciousness to analyze things, and you get vision within. So that is what yoga is. Now, yoga is a popular term nowadays, not only in India, but in the Western world also. And of course, we have even a prime minister doing yoga, whatever. So it's very popular. And in America and Australia and other countries, very, very popular among people, and all the gyms have yoga classes, etc. So it's very popular nowadays. But we should actually understand what that purpose of the yoga is. We have all sorts of misunderstandings about it. Yoga, in its actual meaning, comes from the word yuk, which means to unite, to bring together. Okay? So, in other words, it's a process of unifying everything in the universe, unifying the body and the mind and the soul, etc., and bringing everything in the universe together. That's actually what it is. But in the modern world, of course, yoga looks like something different. So for many people, it may be this physical exercise, or maybe gymnastics or whatever, contorting the body or whatever. They have contests, yoga contests, and see who can do the most complicated asanas or whatever like that, and stretch their joints in different ways, etc., like that. So they have yoga contests even. Or some people may be more interested in trying to get some supernatural powers out of yoga. Some people are interested in the austerity aspect, and they want to go to the Himalayas and practice like yogis and fasting and living in caves, etc. So we have many different ideas about yoga. And who's qualified for yoga also. Maybe even animals qualified. And even dogs can do yoga nowadays, so they have classes for dogs. And they're called doga. Because the dogs are also stressed out. So we have to have some exercises for them also, so they can relax and meditate or whatever, and even for cats as well. But anyway, the authority on yoga was Patanjali. It's about 500 BC or so he wrote the Yoga Sutras. Of course, the system was there before, and we see even that it looks like there were yoga asanas back there in the Mohenjo-daro civilization, Harappa. That was kind of the first civilization of archaeological sites, at least they find like 7,000 years ago in upper India and Pakistan, these huge cities that they built. And they find these seals there, and they have like yoga poses there also. So it goes back that far. But in terms of the more modern history, Patanjali wrote the sutras about maybe 500 BC or so, like that. So these are just sutras, and here he outlined the philosophy of yoga. And of course, there's the Astanga, or the 8 limbs there, starting with yama and niyama, which are very important. So these are regulating your senses and your habits. So the things like no violence, no lying, no theft, no sex, no hoarding, etc. And then the niyamas, cleanliness, satisfaction, austerity, study, worship of God, etc. These are preliminaries. And then you go on to asanas. These are the postures. So these are the most famous aspect that people get into. But technically you should follow the yama and niyama before you even get into the asanas. But most people just ignore the first part, just go on to the asanas. But actually you should do the first two as well, the asanas. And the whole purpose of asanas is to make the body flexible so that you can sit down for long periods of time and meditate. That's the whole purpose of asanas ultimately. And then the yogis discovered something very interesting, and that is that the breath, just the physical breath, actually
had very profound effects on the body and the mind. Yeah? So by controlling the breath, which is pranayama, prana is the breath and yama is control, by regulating the breath, then they discovered that you could get control of the body and control of the mind. So very, very interesting discovery, because prana is just the breath, but actually then we have the pranas in the body related to that. So by regulating this very physical thing, the breath, then you can kind of regulate the pranas that move throughout your body and take care of your whole body, and also control your mind. So the use for the yogi is to control the prana in order that you can start withdrawing your senses and then beginning to concentrate, and then finally go into meditation. That means for a long period of time you can concentrate. And when that dhyana is perfected, then you've got complete control of all thought processes and you stop everything, and then the consciousness of Atma reveals itself. That is the samadhi. Because that whole process of yoga is ultimately stopping the functions of the body and the mind, and through that the Atma reveals itself. That's the whole process of yoga. So the last three here, the dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, are dealing with controlling the mind so that the soul or the Atma reveals itself. That's the whole process of yoga. So it's quite different from the modern yoga, which concentrates simply on doing asanas for your health. So between the body and the soul, we got this subtle substance called the mind. Mind is matter according to the Vedic literatures. It's a type of substance, actually. And it's the bridge between the soul and the body. It's not so gross as the body, it's more subtle. At the same time, it's not the soul, which is non-material. So it's a subtle matter, not gross matter. So it's a little bit of a upgrade of the material body, but it's not actually spiritual also. But it acts as a good bridge between the two. So in the Yoga Sutras, actually the second sutra is this sutra that says that yoga is stopping all actions of material consciousness. So you stop your thought processes, you stop your senses, etc. When that's completely stopped, then what happens? Consciousness is there by itself. That's the Atma. And then you realize, I'm soul. So that's the whole goal of yoga. And at the end of the Yoga Sutra, it says, liberation is freedom from material qualities and material goals. Liberation is establishment of the self and its spiritual nature. So when you get to samadhi, that's when you're fixed in Atma. That's when you're really inside and you're not outside at all. So when you're absorbed in your senses, then you're going outside. And this is what we're doing in science and study and all our material activities. But the process of yoga is to stop all of that. And then self reveals, Atma reveals itself. That's inward. So we're getting some realization inward. And when you get that realization, you get a type of peace that has never been experienced before, because you're liberated from the process of birth and death in the material world. And if you can stay fixed in that, then when you die, you're liberated and you're free from the material world, free from that cycle of birth and death. So that's the real goal of yoga. So, we talked about the gross body and how you have to control the senses. And we have the subtle body with the mind in it. You have to control the mind. Of course, we also have, in the subtle body, we have subtle senses as well as the gross senses, because you can, when you're unconscious and you're dreaming, you do have senses working also, but it's not these senses, obviously, because you're seeing things, but this eye isn't working. So that's your subtle sense. Or if you have a near-death experience, you're seeing with your subtle eye, not with your gross eye, because your brain is dead. So you're out of your body floating around and you're looking at things. So that's obvious you're a subtle eye. And when people do astral travel, the same. They're seeing, but they're not seeing with this eye, obviously. So that's the subtle eye. So your subtle body has senses into it also. It's got mind, intelligence, false ego, it's got pranas, it's got chakras, etc. So it's quite a complex system. Material, but we can't see it. And then, of course, we have the Atma, which is even more important than everything, because this is all matter. It's not conscious in itself. So the consciousness comes from the Atma into the mind, etc., and finally into the body. So, this is the yoga diagram of the different complex currents, subtle currents in the body that you can't really see medically speak. It's not nerves, it's not veins, etc. It's some other subtle currents, also which they discuss in Chinese medicine when they do acupuncture. They're not hitting nerves, they're actually hitting these subtle nutties, these currents of energy. And we have the famous chakra system of the body, which is also subtle energy, these subtle wheels from the Muladhara chakra all the way up to the crown at the top of the head. So, of course, they take care of your subtle body. They also relate to your gross body. And if there's problems in your subtle body, you get problems in your gross body. So anyway, this has to do with consciousness also. So if your consciousness is fixed in the lower chakras, that means you're very materialistic. And if your consciousness gets raised upwards, so your chakras up to the heart chakra at least, then you're starting to get spiritual. And if you get up to the top, then you get liberation. So there's kind of evolution on your chakras also. As you concentrate on different chakras, you can elevate your consciousness. And this is what they do in the yoga system. So then they raise the kundalini from the Muladhara chakra out the top of the thing, and then you get liberation that way. So this we cannot see. We cannot see these chakras on the body with your eye. But interestingly enough, if you were to develop your subtle eye, not the gross eye, the subtle eye, then you would be able to perceive that. And this is exactly what the yogis have done. That's why they've drawn these things that we can't even see, and it looks a little strange, like you get little lotuses on your body with triangles and whatever. It looks strange. But this is what they saw. The yogi could see this. And now we will say, well, how can we prove that, whatever. But interestingly enough, also even in the modern world, there have been some people from not India, but even the Western world, that can perceive the chakras. And then they were a little bit surprised that what are these little things twirling around in your body, because they're not just there, they move because they're wheels. So they move around like this. And they were looking at these things all going on your body, up and down your body like this. And then they looked in the Indian text and they said, oh, these are chakras. So if you have the vision, then you could actually see these chakras moving up and down your body. And they're all energy centers. So we have the Muladhara chakra with very physical things, the Swadhisthana chakra, pleasure, this one at the navel level. This has to do with relationships, etc., also with your digestive system. And if you're, angry, your anger gets stored down there in that chakra. This is the Anahata chakra, a very important one. This shows compassion, etc. And Vashuddha for communications, throat. And your Agya chakra, this is the third eye. And then the top of your head, like that, a very spiritual one. So, as I said, if you were to see your chakras, if you had the subtle eye, then you could see something like this. And this is exactly what one woman in the West, she started seeing the chakras on the body. And this is what she drew. And not only in the back of your body, the front of the body, you have two sets of chakras going up front and back of your body like this. And it also is not two-dimensional, it's actually three-dimensional. So you get different levels of chakras also, not only chakras going up this way, but chakras expanding outwards into more and more subtle levels. So you get level A, level B, level C, like this. Just as you go upwards and get more subtle, so you also go subtler and subtler, also subtler and subtler bodies with all the chakras. So it's a very complex system in your body, but it's all subtle. So, and this whole idea of subtle body, etc., is, I just presented this to show that there are parts of the subtle body which we don't know about, which were actually very important for us. They involve the mind, and they involve, of course, our health and whatever. So that subtle body is very, very powerful as well. It's subtle and you can't see it, but it's very necessary for the human being, and it's also very, very powerful. So, of course, we can just take the whole thing, like subtle body, and say mind in a very general sense. That mind is a very powerful instrument for the human being. If we use the mind properly, it's a source of creation. We can do a lot of things with it. And thus we find that civilizations, as they develop, they can develop all sorts of things like arts and sciences because of the mind, whereas the animal cannot do that. The animal doesn't have a civilization. But the human being can develop groups of people, and then they can develop culture and civilization, arts and sciences, etc. because of the mind. The mind is developed. Unfortunately, it can also be the source of destruction. That same mind, when it develops, can be positive and create things. It can also destroy things. And this is the whole problem that the ancient sages understood in India, that the mind is a friend, but it's also an enemy. And it can be very, very dangerous as well. And that is why they also restricted knowledge, because if the wrong people got the knowledge, they would be very destructive. So they didn't give knowledge to everybody. And that's why the Vedas were also restricted. Not certain people, you cannot hear the Vedas or say the Vedas, because if you try to get it, you'll misuse it. So therefore, they understood the destructive power of the mind also. And so that happens, we see in the modern world, in spite of the fact we say we're very civilized, we see that a lot of our energy and a lot of our money and a lot of our intelligence and a lot of our science goes into defense and weapons, which destroy. So it doesn't sound very intelligent to spend most of your time scheming how to destroy your own species. But that's what we do. But this is not intelligent, but that's what we do. So just a little problem with the mind. Mind, they don't really study it except in relation to things like psychology and psychiatry, but even then they're a little bit puzzled by everything. Yeah? And the others maybe neurology, where they get into the brain part of things like that. But then there's another area of mind which is maybe more practical, and that is the capacity of the mind. So we know that, of course, in India, scriptures always speak, Bhagavad Gita speaks about that, and the yoga scriptures speak about the power of the mind, etc., and how yogis have great mental powers, etc. But in the modern world also, people have begun to understand this, at least some scientists have begun to understand that the mind is very, very powerful and something we don't really understand. For instance, we'll find here these Hal Puthoff, a PhD at Stanford Research Institute. He was commissioned to research like telepathy and psychic powers. It was actually financed by the CIA. But he's he's still alive, I think. He's a very serious scientist. He's working in quantum physics. But he was assigned to research psychic powers because the United States heard that Russia was investigating psychic powers in the military. So therefore the military sponsored this program to figure out about psychic powers, because the Russians had some very far out psychics who could move objects across tables and do all sorts of things, you know. So, and then you could use that for military purposes. So, the Americans decided we should also, investigate this a little bit. So they spent some money to investigate psychic powers. So they hired Hal Puthoff. So he designed experiments as a scientist, because that's what he's into, to see if it's true. People do have psychic powers or not, because usually we hear about, this is all something in imagination or hypnosis or tricks or whatever like that. So then, but then Russia was seriously investing money in this, So then America thought we should also figure out if this is really true. So Ingo, this Hal Puthoff began his experiments, and he chose particularly one person, Ingo Swann, who was from childhood seemed to have these natural clairvoyant abilities, etc. So he used him as the experiment, and he did many tests on him. Well, many, many times, and trying to figure out if there's any cheating, and trying to avoid all of that sort of thing. Many, many different types of experiments. And as a result of that, then he concluded that he does have psychic powers. He can do things with his mind which you cannot explain by normal science. Which is, it just says, despite the ambiguities inherent in the type of exploration covered in these programs, the integrated result appear to prove unequivocal evidence of a human capacity to access events remote in space and time, however falteringly by some cognitive process not yet understood. So this remote in space and time means that you can access an event space-wise, let's say 3,000 miles away. He can identify, you just give a latitude, longitude of a place, and he can identify what's happening there at this moment in a few seconds. And they did experiment after experiment like that to prove that, you know. So that's space. And time also, you could go forward in time and backward in time. And he can make predictions about the future, or he can go back in time and witness events 3,000 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 5 years ago, what happened at that certain place. So it was true, he could do this. And this was confirmed by a scientist using scientific method experiments. My years of involvement as a research manager in these programs has left me with the conviction that this fact must be taken into account in any attempt to develop an unbiased picture of the structure of reality. So because he could do this, and it was using some process with the mind over space and time, then his conclusion was that mind itself, what happened here? Went off. Back. Okay, so mind itself seemed to be some sort of matter, because it could also influence matter. So it was a type of energy. But that's something that science has not accepted yet, that mind is actually a type of matter. But of course we know that it is, according to the Vedic literature. It's one of the elements. Manas is one of the elements, just like earth, water, fire, air, ether, manas, it's etc. So not foreign for us, but for scientists it's very difficult to accept that. But he understood this is something in reality itself in terms of matter. It exists, mind exists as some sort of force, but we don't know what it is. And it's beyond space and time. That was the conclusion. This is one experiment. It was a practical experiment also. The spy planes or whatever, Sputniks or whatever, they knew something was happening in Russia. They were doing something in Siberia, some secret place. They were building something like that. So they sent their spy airplane over there and they took photographs of it. But this is top secret. So they have the photographs. So then they took this Ingo Swann as the subject and they said, okay, we have this certain thing. They put a number on the photographs and put it in an envelope. They gave him the number. Okay, identify what does the number mean? So then he drew this diagram, a map of a place with the buildings and then roads. And then he drew this diagram here of a thing like a framework on wheels going over rails like this. This is what he drew. Okay? Just from getting a number. Okay? So what the photograph actually was a photograph of a military installation, and they were building a big nuclear submarine actually. But he actually got the map of the place right, and he got the figure there, as you see the thing is going on the thing, like that. So he was actually able to get correct information just from a number of what that thing was. And there was no way he could know, because this was a top secret photograph taken by an airplane flying over Siberia, and then nobody knew about the photograph at all except the top people in the military. But yet he could get this information just from a number. Yeah? They did other experiments, like one is he went to Jupiter long before they had sent up a probe that was able to get close enough to Jupiter to get information about the temperature and the composition of the atmosphere, etc. In fact, they had sent a probe up to that direction, but it took 10 years to get there. So 10 years before it got there, he was told to go to Jupiter and examine the atmosphere. So then he did his meditation, whatever, got into his state. Then he came back and he made this file, and he said, okay, this is the composition of the atmosphere, so much oxygen, so much nitrogen, da 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 da. This is the temperature, so much minus degrees. This. So he gave all these things. They could not verify anything, so it was an experiment which they couldn't do it because they hadn't got that close to Jupiter yet, and it had taken 10 years to get there. So they just got all the information, they just sealed it up. When they got the information 10 years later, and they opened the envelope, it all corresponded. Temperature was right, composition of the atmosphere was right, plus there were a few things he said that they couldn't confirm. Like he said on the surface of Mars, there was like round rocks rolling around or whatever like that. So they couldn't verify things like that. But 80% of the information they gave was accurate. But they didn't even know that information until 10 years later when the probe went to Mars. So that's a very great, just I don't know how distance between Mars, Jupiter and Earth? I don't know. It's more than thousands of miles, I know that. Maybe it's 100,000 miles or something, I don't know what it is. But it's a long, very long distance. But a few seconds he can go there, get the information and come back. Just with his mind. So it shows the mind is very, very much. 750 million kilometers in 5 seconds. So very, very powerful. So that was just Ingo Swann and Hal Puthoff. That was their conclusion that, yeah, the mind is there and it's something powerful and it's beyond time and space. We don't know what it is. Professor Robert John in Princeton University was interested in moving objects with the mind. Telekinesis, I think it's called. So his experiment, one of his experiments was you got these little round balls that are in the thingy, and you press a button, it'll fall down, and it can go left or right. And it's perfectly level, so the chances are 50-50. It'll go left or it'll go right. We just press, and half will go here, half will go there. So the thing is that now you press the button, but then you say, make it go to the right, make it go to the right, make it go to the right, make it go to the right. And we'll see if you get more balls going to the right than to the left, which proves that somehow the mind is influencing the balls to go to the right. So when they did that, they found, yes, the mind could influence. This is just normal people, not psychics or anything. Go to the right, go to the right, go to the right. And then they could get, it wasn't big, but let's say like 2% or something extra would go to the right. So another thing, how can the mind influence objects like this, not just go over time and space, but can push matter? So therefore the conclusion was that there's something we don't know. Well, mind itself, it's got a force behind it. And as this Dunn says, similar to what mystics have claimed throughout the ages, now we have scientific evidence that the mind has these great powers to do things with matter. In China also they've done experiments, so some far out experiments, and they have a whole research institute dedicated to discussing, investigating these things because they do have people there, the Qigong, which are they're kind of like yoga, they do, and they get some special powers. So one researcher was interested to see that if they had the powers to actually affect matter and how we could prove that they could affect matter. So then one experiment was you take hydrogen and carbon monoxide and change it into carbon dioxide. So you can do that if you have a pressure and heat, 300 degrees Celsius heat and 30 atmospheres pressure. And you combine the hydrogen and carbon monoxide, it'll turn to carbon dioxide. So of course that means it's going to be very hot or whatever. So the idea of this experiment was that the man had to do this with his mind, combine the two things and make the carbon dioxide with his mind, and not get a machine, and press it together and mix it up or whatever like that. To do it with his mind. So they tried various things, and the containers kept breaking. Well, then finally they used steel containers, and then he actually was able to combine them with his mind and raise the temperature up to 250 atmospheres and 300 Celsius with his mind, and he got the combination. Combine it with his mind without any physical instruments. So again, it was something very remarkable. This is, I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a kind of a legend. This one person, he had very great powers, and in fact so much powers that they had a whole group of scientists studying him, like 16 scientists studying him because he had such far out powers. So on one occasion then, he caused a 100-pound sack of sugar to go through a solid wall with his mind. He passed matter through matter with his mind. Which sounds impossible, but he did. Another experiment was the bug experiment. So here we have a little bug in a jar. So his feat is to meditate on that bug and get him out of the jar without breaking the jar. Like that. So he did it with his mind. So this was very mystifying. How did he do it? Did he decompose the bug and reconstitute him again? What do they call that? Teleportation or something, and they decompose him. So, or did he just drag the bug through the glass wall? Well, how did he do it? So then they did it again, and then they got a special camera, I think a Nikon camera that goes 300 frames per second, which is very fast because a normal cinema thing goes 16 frames per second, I think. So it's got 300 frames per second. So they had a special camera there to watch what happened. Did it go here and suddenly end up on the other side, or did he drag it through the glass? So they found on 3 frames the bug was going through the glass. Well, how you can do that when nobody knows, and the bug was still alive also. So something, power of the mind we don't know about. So these are some of the powers of the mind, and with the yogis also. There's so many stories about yogis in India doing fantastic things. So not so far out once we see that even in other countries they're doing such things. And of course in Russia, certain psychics can move objects with their mind, etc. So mind is very, very mysterious and has a lot of great powers. So in the Bhagavad Gita also, we find that Krishna, especially in chapter 2, he pays a lot of attention to the mind. And he has this verse here: one must deliver himself with the help of his mind and not degrade himself. Mind is a friend of the conditioned soul and his enemy as well. So it's more on, I'd say, an ethical level than just a mystic power level or whatever like that, moving objects or whatever. It's actually to do with your elevation of your consciousness and elevation of your, say your civilization or whatever. And furthermore, not only you elevate or degrade yourself by the mind, you also determine your next body by your mind. So whatever you remember when you die, you become that. So that's also very, very, powerful influence of the mind. So I think I explained this in that other class about how we saw that the mind actually gets an impression at death, and that impression can carry over and imprint your next body. So in the case of a person who was shot in the chest, imprint was got into his subtle body, in his mind. Subtle body held the wound, bullet hole wounds in his subtle body. That subtle body went into the next gross body and imprinted itself so that his gross body got the impression of the wounds, and he ended up with a birthmark. Same as the pattern on his previous chest, when he did the autopsy report of his chest with all the bullet hole wounds. Same pattern came out in his next lifetime on his body. Why? Because it was held in the subtle body. Yeah? Just like you have a mold for a sandesh, let's say, and then you make sandesh with a little flower on it or something like that. So like that, your subtle body is there, imprints onto your gross body. Yeah? So this is what the mind can do. carry over from life to life. So we also know from Bhagavad Gita that the mind, if we don't control it, then it's a source of our limitation. So it'll just push us here and there. It will influence our intelligence, it will influence our senses, and then we will just go here and there without logical reason or whatever. So therefore the mind has to be controlled. So though Arjuna complained, oh, it's too difficult to control the mind, I can't do this, then Krishna answers, well, it's undoubtedly very difficult to curb the restless man, but it's possible by pseudo practice and detachment. So if you really want to advance and progress, you have to control the mind, even if it's difficult. So it means practice. So, therefore, the mind is very important for us. He also says here that the working senses are superior to dull matter, mind is higher than senses, intelligence is higher than mind, soul is higher than the intelligence. So he gives hierarchy here. What should control what? So intelligence can control mind, but then intelligence has to have some inspiration. So the inspiration for the intelligence is the soul. Unfortunately, if we don't know what the soul is, then our intelligence isn't going to get any control at all, and the mind isn't going to control the intelligence. And then we end falling down into the material world again. Yeah. So back to this diagram again. The mind is very important for us. And it determines our next body, and in this lifetime, we can control the mind, and we can elevate ourselves, or we can degrade ourselves. And of course, as well as that, we have psychic powers or whatever. You can do so many things with your mind, especially if you're a yogi, and you can see the future and see the past. You can go here and there with your mind even. So the mind is very, very powerful, even though it's material. So how to control the mind? So one easy answer given in the second chapter is that higher taste. If you got higher taste, then you control the mind. Of course, the higher taste in the sense means if you have a little taste for Atma, you control the intelligence controls the mind, like that. From Krishna conscious point of view, you got a taste for Krishna, then you can control all this. Okay, so we got to develop that spiritual taste. Yeah. Okay. So now just a little bit of practical considerations, because we're not all yogis and whatever like that. So to control the mind, we should understand that the mind has the capacity to choose. Now, we don't always think about that, but we're actually, even when we're not consciously choosing, we are choosing. But we're just choosing the same thing all the time, basically. Yeah? So that's what we call a habit. We get a habit, then we make the same choices all the time. Yeah? We may eat the same food, we may walk in the same direction, the same path all the time, we may read the same newspapers or whatever, we may study the same books all the time, we may listen to the same music all the time. This is habit. Yeah? But we're choosing to do that. Huh? So, we have to train ourselves to actually broaden our choices, not just work on habit. We have to think of new ways of choosing things to do. So there's one thing the mind can do. It can choose its own goals. It's not limited, it has to do this. We can choose something else, and then we can try to achieve it. So we can choose, and then once we choose what to do, the goal, then the mind is also helpful in achieving the goal. So first we can create the goal, and then we can achieve the goal. So the mind is instrumental in both these processes. Yeah? But we can't even achieve the goal unless we first choose the goal. And most people don't even choose the goal. So that's why we don't go anywhere. We don't know what to choose is one thing. Or somebody else chooses for us. Huh? So we have to get control of that mind in order to make our proper choices and achieve our proper goals. Then we have to actually get control of the mind rather than be controlled by the mind. Huh? So, stimuli come in through our senses to the mind. Huh? And then we can do two things. We can react without thinking, which is sometimes what animals do. They get sent, okay, danger, and then they either fight or they run or whatever. So that's immediate reaction, which is instinctive. So that's one thing, reaction. The other is a carefully thought out response, which is harder to do, but you have to practice to do that. So stimuli comes in, and then you respond after careful choice. So that way, when you start choosing and not running on automatic pilot and just reaction or instinct or whatever, that's where you begin to operate your free will. But to do that, you have to train yourself. Yeah. So the stimulus goes to action like that. This becomes habit, and this is what we call conditioning. Probably heard of Pavlov and the dogs, conditioned dogs. Yeah. Yeah, where they ring a bell and then they give dog the food. So then every time he hears the bell, he thinks food. So he starts salivating like this. Ring the bell, he salivates. It's because you conditioned him to think bell means food. So then ring the bell, he gets hungry and he starts salivating. So that's conditioning. So a lot of our actions in this world are from conditioning. That we react in a certain way. All by conditioning. So these are our habits. Some of them may be good for our protection or whatever, but a lot of them restrict us. And they restrict us from developing properly or fulfilling our goals or becoming satisfied. So this is where these habits become not so good for us. So we have to change that. So when the stimulus comes in, then we have to think very carefully about it. Then we do the action. So the whole thought process in between the stimulus and the action is very important. And this means we have to have some strong internal values upon which to judge what to do. If we don't have the strong internal values, then we'll be stuck and we'll go back to our habit again, which means no thought, just automatic. But if we want to choose properly, we have to have some strong internal values. So we have to cultivate those values also. But if we do that, then that means we are responsible for our choices. Otherwise, it's automatic, like just getting pushed by material nature. As in Bhagavad Gita chapter 3, it says, we're just pushed around by material nature. Prakriti is doing everything. Yeah, we're just pushed. So that's the person who is just acting according to his habits and is not making choices. Basically a person in Tamagun. No choice. He has the ability to choose, but he's not choosing. He's getting pushed by material nature, pushed by his karma. But we can rise above that if we take responsibility for our choices. Then we can change our lives. So we have to change those habits. Our behavior is a function of our decisions, not our conditions. So generally, we will like to blame everybody else for what happens, or condition, because it's like this or this, therefore I did this. So that means our behavior is based upon our conditions, not upon our decisions. So the real responsible person will act according to his own decisions and not blame anybody else. I did this because this is what I believe in. This is my value. Therefore, I do like this. So we have to subordinate these certain feelings that come up to the values on which we base our life. And those values are also related to our goals. And by doing this, then we get real free choice. Yeah. So, if you don't do this, then you are just reacting to all the stimuli. And you're basing your actions upon your feelings, which are aroused by that stimulus, which may be anger or lust or greed or whatever. And then you act on that. So, therefore, you're controlled by your feelings and your circumstances. The feelings, of course, are aroused by the circumstances. And based on that, then you react. And if you do so, then you can't really set any goals. Your feelings and circumstances are going to interfere with that. And you can't go anywhere. You can't create any change. You're stuck in your habits. So we have to be aware of that. Okay. So, therefore, instead of being reactive like this, we have to be proactive. So, we make decisions based upon carefully considered and integral values. That means values that we really value inside ourselves, not values other people put on us. Like most of our values come from education and school and government and whatever they all say. You have to do this, you have to do this is good, that's bad, or whatever. That's all externalized, and they're pushing it into you. And that's what schools basically do. The internal value comes from within. It's something you're very convinced of. So that's if you're convinced of it, that's how you can decide what to do, if you have those values inside yourself. But to get those values inside yourself, which are your real values, you really have to work on that also. It's not some casual thing that you can just say, oh, these are my values, fine, and then forget about it, because it won't be internalized. And you really have to work on that also. But if you do that, then you can change. So it's not superficial outside values, something inside. So you have to be a little introspective. So, when we choose these values, we're also choosing certain goals in our life. Now, most people don't really choose those goals. They are conditioned by certain things. So everybody has the same goals. So a lot of people want to get married. Or their parents want to get them married. And then they want to have families. These are universal things. So not so surprising. And then to support the family, you need money. To get the money, you need a job. To get a job, you need education. All these things go together. And then besides getting the family, you want to spend a little extra and get some security, like house and whatever like that, so you get your possessions and whatever. And then to get a little relaxation, you go for pleasure. Recreation, whatever like that. And then you have your circle of friends and enemies. Well, these are common things that are for everybody in society, anywhere in the world. They'll have all these goals anyway. So it's nothing special. But you have to work even for these goals. And therefore you have to concentrate on them. And the same process, you have to set a goal for the family, a goal for your work, and a goal for this and that, if you want to achieve it nicely. So you have to concentrate on it again. Use your mind to setting a goal and concentrating on the goal to achieve it. Same principle applies. But these are very common goals, and they all have to do with ultimately the gross material body. On a higher level, of course, then we can deal with, okay, I want peace of mind, no stress, etc. We're dealing with the mind. But we rarely deal with the soul. What about the soul? The soul is like the bird in the cage, and we're just taking care of the cage and polishing it up and doing this and that, decorating it, putting lights on it or whatever, and the bird inside is starving to death. So like that, the soul is sitting there, and we don't have any goal for the soul, which is actually us. So therefore, it's not a very healthy situation. So therefore, when we start developing these internal goals, that gets closer to the idea of the self and the Atma and spiritual life. So internal, we have to say, who am I? What are my needs? What will satisfy me? What's my real nature? My true qualities? What are the principles by which I live? Of course, this can be on the material level also, but maybe a little more elevated. But it can also get into the spiritual ultimately. But nevertheless, these are the internal goals. And then ultimately, if we do get to the spiritual center, understand we're Atma, not the body, then we get a real basis for stability. Because when we get that center, we have internal guidance, and we don't have to depend on others. We have security, because we know we're not the body anyway, and the body is temporary, whatever, so we're not so concerned about that. And we get power, because we can make our own decisions, and we're not influenced by external circumstances. And we get wisdom, because we understand there are higher principles that work within this material world, not this matter randomly interacting. Right? So all of this will come about, guidance, security, power, and wisdom, by developing our self. So if we have low sense of security, we feel very helpless. If we have a high sense of security, then we're confident we can face anything in the world. If we have low sense of guidance, then we have to ask everybody else what to do. If we have high sense of guidance, we can make our own decisions. If we have low wisdom, we have a very distorted vision of the world. We'll blame everybody else for all the problems. If we have a high wisdom, then we have a very accurate vision of everything. We understand there's higher plans in this world, and there's Krishna's plan, etc. If we have low power, then we don't want to do anything. Let everybody else do something. And if we have high sense of power, then we have the freedom to create our future. So, therefore, we have to get that internal cultivation working. So that's one of the goals. We have to start getting our internal values. We set the goal, and then we achieve the goal. So as I said, the mind is useful for achieving the goal. What that means is that if you think about your goal enough, then you achieve it. Okay? So you have a mental creation before it physically manifests. Okay? So you think about the object enough, it materializes basically, which is like the yogi, you can materialize, Sai Baba can materialize a gold ring or something like that. So if you think about it enough, it manifests. Like that. So therefore, there's two creations, the mental creation and then the physical creation. So if you can concentrate on your goal enough, you can achieve it. It sounds, okay, very simple, we'll just concentrate on and get our goal. But unfortunately, people cannot concentrate. So therefore, they don't achieve the goals. But the mind is so powerful that this is what you can do. As we see, by concentrating at death, then you would attain that in your next lifetime. It gives you the body. Your mind gives you a body by your concentration on a certain object. Yeah? So same in this lifetime, concentrate on something, then if you concentrate enough, you get it. Yeah? So again, this is the great power of the mind. But the thing is that most people cannot concentrate. The mental creation does not solidify, so therefore it doesn't take place. You don't get your goal. Yeah? We're too distracted. So Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, it's undoubtedly very difficult to curb the restless mind, but it's possible by suitable practice and detachment. So just to summarize, we can create change, but the main change is we have to change internally and not be guided by habits. So we have to start cultivating the self within and developing our internal goals and internal values, etc. So it starts inside, and then that will start expanding outward to the mind, intelligence, body, and outside beyond that. So change is possible, but we also have to work at it. As we see, if you want to achieve it, then you have to mental creation first, and if you don't concentrate, you don't get it. So change is possible, but it takes effort. So by practice, you get the result. So you have to daily drill your mind. So we want to change ourselves, but sometimes we'll try to change everybody else. But that's more difficult. So if we want to change anything, start with ourselves. And when we change ourselves, then we can start changing others. But if we don't change ourselves, nothing's going to change. So, therefore, we get power. When we change ourselves, we get the power to change others. If we don't change ourselves, nothing happens. So, we should choose goals. And as I said, most people just have the common goals. That's nothing. But even then, for those goals, you have to concentrate also to get them. But we want to go beyond those common goals and get beyond the gross body, the subtle body, and get to the Atma. So then we have to use our intelligence more. We can use scripture, imagination, etc., to choose our goals, even our material goals, in such a way that they coordinate with our spiritual goals. Use our imagination for that. Yeah. So, among those goals, then we have to start codifying these eternal principles by which we base our choices in life. Some things we cannot change. This is Krishna's grace. We have to accept that also. This is what we call tolerance. But if we change ourselves, we can change others. So this is the idea. So we're not trying to make everybody else change. We change ourselves. And when we're setting our goals, and we're carrying our activities, we have to do it in such a way that we minimize the disturbance to others. In other words, we don't want to create bad karma by the whole thing. So we do the best way possible with minimum interference. In other words, we don't exploit others for our own benefit. Okay. We can summarize this in another way. Some basic laws. The law of attraction. Whatever's in your mind, that becomes reality. So that we have to think properly, put your proper goals in. If you got the wrong goal, then you get the wrong result. Nothing's going to happen, then nothing happens. So you think negatively, you get negative results. So your mind produces your reality, attracts your reality like that. You think very carefully what's in your mind. The law of karma. So we have to think of our goals, achieve our goals, but we have to do it in such a way that it minimizes the violence on others. The law of responsibility. When we learn to act properly and responsibly, then we get free of the law of karma because we minimize our exploitative activities. And the law of change. If we want change, change the self before we change others. And the law of choice. You use your inner guide to choose. Now this may be a little difficult, but there's a simple principle. You can, if you have a choice and it's difficult to make the choice, you can ask, I think 5 questions here. Is it good for your health? Very gross level. And if it's good for your health, you do it. If it's not good for your health, don't do it. Finish. It's very simple. Second one. Is it going to create mental level, happiness and whatever, or is it going to create problems and stress and whatever like that? If it's going to create the happiness, do it. Is it truthful? Is it a little higher level, like an intellectual level or moral level, whatever. And if it's truthful, okay, do it. If it's deceptive, don't do it. Will it create beauty in the world? Do it. If it creates ugliness in the world, don't do it. This means it's destructive to the environment or whatever. And the most important one of all, will it create unconditional love? If it does, fine, do it. If it doesn't, don't do it. So for any choice, all 5 should be yes. If there's one no, don't do it. So very simple guideline. Okay. So ultimately, you practice unconditional love, which is bhakti yoga. The best way to control the mind.
So Hare Krishna, thank you for everyone, especially for His Holiness Bhanu Swami Maharaj, because next class is going to happen, so we not have much time for question answers. Who all enjoyed the sessions?